Good afternoon, everyone. It is afternoon. It's noon here, at least where I am, not where you are in Texas. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman, and I am very fortunate today to have Keri Smith of the Deprogrammed podcast and YouTube channel too, right? Are you
Yes.
on YouTube?
Yeah,
Yep.
on YouTube.
Right, with me today, and we have got a great show for you. If you're not familiar with Keri, she is so she's the founder of the Deprogram podcast, and she's also the founder of Civility Dinners, which hopefully you
Yes.
can tell us a little bit about. And you were once upon a time what they call a social justice warrior, or now we've transitioned to the term woke. And so, what I'm hoping Keri can do, I've invited her here today to give us some insight into what it's like growing up and going into that sort of mindset of, social justice, change the world, and then arriving at a point when you're an adult where you realize that isn't really you
Hmm.
and you need to deprogram from that and what that's like, because many of us are parents, we have kids in schools, or we just have kids, interacting with other kids and other adults who are pushing them on social media everywhere to be woke. And it might be tempting to think, well, it's just a phase, or they'll outgrow it, or oh, every kid wants to change the world, and kind of feel like it doesn't have really lasting negative impact. And so I wanted Keri to share with us the truth of that, because there's more to it than that. So, welcome, Keri. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Deb, for having me.
You're so
Yeah,
welcome.
I'm excited to finally talk to you. It's the first time we've talked on camera.
I know it is. So I mean, we've talked to you a little bit behind the scenes about some of this stuff, and I got interested in this topic because I heard Keri talking about it on another show, and it really hit me because I have, I guess you could call it a privilege in a way, the privilege of not having grown up woke, or not having grown up even, I mean, to the extent that anyone tried to make me a social justice warrior, and I kind of beat that by virtue of generation, the generation I'm in. But even in college, when it was going on, there's just something was about my personality that I was kind of always an iconoclast weirdo on the outside of everything. And in a way, it worked to my benefit in the end, because I didn't
Mhm.
have to go through what you're going through. And I feel very lucky, because it sounds
That's
painful.
interesting to me, the people who escaped it.
Yeah.
Because I knew so many people like myself who fell into it in
Right.
school. When I assume a lot of the parents who watch your show maybe have kids who are elementary school age or high school,
All the way through
maybe
K
college.
12. It's mostly
Yeah,
K 12. Yeah, some college, but mostly K 12. I even have some K 12 students who tune in every now and again and are like, what's going on?
trying to figure things out. Well, yeah,
Exactly.
so when I fell into it, it was a while ago. This is woke has been a long time coming. So I did not get any of this ideology fed to me in K through 12, fortunately. And I was really lucky. I got to go to a science and math high school. It was a boarding school. It's state funded. I grew up in South Carolina, and some of the schools like South Carolina that have maybe below average stats and education rates, they started these schools called governor schools where you
Hmm.
can apply. If you get in, it's residential. And I lived there for 11th and 12th grade. It was the best education I got. It was better than, I ended up going to Duke University. It was better than Duke. Um, but Duke is where I encountered social justice, and that was the late 90s.
Hmm.
I'm aging myself. But yeah, so it was at the time, the way I encountered it in school was because of my minor. So I was a women's studies minor. I was a biological anthropology anatomy major, but women's studies minor. And at that time, it had not infiltrated. This was over 20 years ago, so it had not infiltrated into the hard sciences really. I didn't get any of this messaging in my science classes, but I did get it through women's studies, critical race theory, gender theory, all the classes I was taking as part of that minor.
Hmm.
And the way that I understood it at that time, and I think this is true for kids today too, but now they're getting it in everywhere. So I can't imagine how overwhelming it is. They're getting it in the hard sciences in college. They're getting it before they get to college. They're getting it in kindergarten in some cases.
Right.
So I don't know what that's like, but I know that the way in which I started falling into it was presented as a kind of liberalism. It was presented as progressivism, and something good and positive that's beneficial to the world. And it really sells itself well. It sells itself as an ideology that's about ending oppression, ending racism, ending sexism, opening your eyes to the ways in which these invisible prejudices and isms impact society. And you sort of move into it by degrees. And that's definitely what happened to me. One of the first things they do, and I'm sure kids are learning this now before college, is they change a lot of words, they change a lot of definitions. They're very concerned with controlling
words.
language. Yes. And so
Yeah.
one of the first things I learned was this new attempted redefinition of racism and sexism, where they're saying racism is prejudice plus power, sexism is prejudice plus power. Therefore, it's impossible to be racist towards white people, or it's impossible to be sexist towards men. And once you've got that belief implanted, then you can move further into it, because now you have a pat sort of explanation of why it is that you're now being taught to judge people and treat people differently on the basis of race and sex. Your brain sort of short circuits. You no longer, you're being told that's not racist to do that. And
Interesting.
yeah,
And this is all the way back in the late 90s.
yeah,
And what's so interesting to me is that they didn't have any burden. It's like they keep moving that goal post too. That they didn't have any burden to justify the equation of whiteness with power either, it sounds like. And what is funny to me about that is they're just equating being a majority population, which kind of by definition, if you're the majority population, you're going to have the majority of people in power going to look like you. I mean, that's just the law of averages. Okay. So
yeah,
in most cases, so they're equating like the majority population equals the people
power.
in power. And that's all we have to say about that. We don't need to explain people in Appalachia or even South
Yeah,
Carolina for that matter, who are
exactly.
not powerful.
Because they're looking at people, the social justice people, they teach you to look at people as group members first. You're not looking at Deb as an individual. You're looking at Deb as a white person and a woman and straight, and everything is broken down by what identity groups you're in. And so one of the things we drew from back then, even, and I know everyone's drawing from it today, there are these pseudo academics in the field today. One of the really popular ones is Robin DiAngelo, of course, or Ibram X. Kendi. They are building upon the work of prior pseudo-intellectuals who are pushing this stuff, like Peggy McIntosh. So we were looking at Peggy McIntosh in the 80s. You know, she was this very, very privileged white woman, you know, from the 1%.
Little protection, maybe.
Yeah, perhaps.
Yeah.
She's looking at her life like, why do I have everything? Well, it must be my
I
whiteness.
feel bad about it. I'm going to project it onto all the white people in the
All
world.
the white people. So she wrote something called the Invisible Knapsack, which was the kind of the white privilege checklist. And if you go through that checklist as a young person who, you know, when I was 18 and I'm reading that, it was eye-opening to me. I was thinking about things I hadn't thought about before. So there are things in there like when you turn on the television, you see people, you mostly see people who are your race, okay? And I'm like, oh, that is a privilege. That is a white privilege. But what you're saying is true. Much later on, much more recently, I've started to think about that in terms of what you're calling majority privilege. Some of those things are more accurately termed majority privilege. If you go to China and you turn on the television, you're going to see a majority of Chinese people on television. That's because that's the majority of the people who live there. It's not necessarily something that's inherently you're privileged because you're Chinese in China.
Right. Well, it also implies that there's something bad or negative or that makes you feel bad about seeing people who don't look like you. Like that act in and of itself is a negative thing, objectively speaking. So in other words, if I went to Africa and I turned on the television and most of the people on the television were black, that somehow that would cause me some kind of distress or pain. Why
Right.
would it? Why would
Harm.
it? Like, I mean, I don't
Harm.
even, yeah, like, why would that harm me? First of all, if I were a child and I weren't able to like put it together that, well, I'm in a country where the majority population is black, that's why they're black. Even so, like, I just don't think that's how children in particular operate. I don't
No,
think they sit there and go, I feel harmed because nobody looks like me. And yet that's the argument, and nobody ever has to back it up.
no. No, there was nothing scientific about her paper, but it's been the basis of countless studies and books and other new terms that have been coined. So she coined the phrase white privilege. You know, Robin DiAngelo is credited with white fragility, which built on the concept of white privilege. And they just continue constructing this Tower of Babel of, you know, the social justice ideology, and it's all resting on sand. I mean, if you get down to the bottom of it, it's like, what were the foundational texts here? Okay, an essay?
A rich white lady wrote an essay in a magazine.
Yes.
There you go. Another rich white lady wrote a book about how guilty she feels being a rich white lady.
Yes.
And suddenly we have, you know, sounds to me like rich white lady privilege. I don't know, but what I'm curious about is you mentioned how it sells itself based on the goodness component.
Yes.
And we might be getting towards the why some people attach to it and some people don't. And it's probably like a compliment to you and not so much one to me. But the point being, if you're a well-meaning, you know, good, open, you know, sort of helping
Maybe
personality
naive also.
could be, but point being, like, there may be like a personality type or even just a focus, a worldview focus. So you know, most of us as parents want our kids to be good people. We want them to be nice and kind and caring. And, you know, while not all of us push the sharing because you have to message, I think, you know, thinking about my own kids, I wanted them to be nice people, like be kind was like a pretty common thing, right? So if they're selling you as a college student on this is what it is to be a good person,
Yes.
and these are the PhDs, the experts, or the adults who are in the position of power over you, it seems to me you'd have to be quite the skeptic to not believe it.
Correct. Yeah, you would be. And I hear from parents, as I'm sure you do, who have children who've gone off to college in some cases where their daughter is coming home and speaking woke or starting to express some of the tenets of this belief system, and sometimes they'll say to me, they want me to know she's a good person, she has a big heart. And I'm like, no, you don't have to convince me of that. I know there are a lot of especially women, young women, girls who this ideology preys on their empathy, and it's presented as a way to do good and be good in the world. And it's easy to buy into that. And what you're saying, maybe there's a certain personality type. I think a lot of things go into it. In my case, and I'll just speak for me and no one else, but I was raised with a belief system. I was raised in the Southern Baptist Church, and I ended up walking away from that when I was at the science and math school. Like, so around 15 or 16, I started walking away from that faith. I saw some hypocrisy, and now I look back on it and I realize I allowed con artists and bad representatives, bad faith people to influence my view of Christianity. But so I walked away from it, and there was a gap there. There was a hole there for some kind of meaning, some way of interpreting the world. And now I'm at a phase in my life where I'm wondering if maybe, if not all, but at least most people need something like that, need a belief system. This is the way of interpreting the world as you go out into it. And social justice filled that gap. So social justice, if you want to break down where it came from, I agree with the people who say it's sort of a marriage of Marxism and postmodernism. We were definitely reading Marxist writers in my women's studies classes. So Foucault, like there was that foundation of Marxism that was a part of it. But what they've done is they've kind of tweaked it. So it's not the Marxism about class and wealth. They've taken a belief system that said the best way to look at the world and interpret the world is as a struggle between class groups for wealth. Mm-hmm. And we need to redistribute the wealth to make everyone equal and happy. They've taken that and they've mutated it. And they've said, no, the best way to look at the world is as a struggle between identity groups for power. and we have to redistribute power equally among these groups, and then everybody will be equal and happy. So that's the tweak that's been done. It's centered around power and identity rather than wealth and class. I'm sorry about the dogs.
That's
Just
okay.
1 second.
Yeah.
Okay.
But what I find interesting is that you mentioned, we redistribute the power and then everybody will be equal and happy. And that's another sort of hidden claim that people don't really question. Like, why would you assume that being equal to other people leads to happiness? In other words, I don't look around at my neighbor down the street who drives a BMW and has a bigger house, or even Elon Musk. Okay. Let's get, people who have a lot more power and a lot more money than I have. And I don't think like, oh, I'm so unhappy because they have what they have and I don't have it, or somebody has power and I don't have. In fact, I actively don't want that kind of power. Like I like being invisible and kind of, not having, because with that comes responsibility. But there's this underlying assumption with all of this that we're being held back from true happiness and true mental health and all the good things, right? By this distribution of power being unequal. And I've never seen any evidence whatsoever that equality leads to happiness, especially a forced equality.
A forced equality. Yeah. Well, there are so many things that are unsaid in this belief system.
Right.
So most of the people who are in social justice are never interrogating to this degree the belief system. They're not actually sitting down and having conversations, Deb, about like, what is equality? And do I believe that human nature would allow for everyone to be, for us to reach this utopia if only we forcibly redistributed power and made sure there was the correct percentage of women in STEM and women as garbage truck drivers. They don't talk about that part, but
or soldiers, frontline soldiers,
right?
Right.
But if only everything were reflective of the percentages of representation, then we would, then everybody would have no reason to complain. Not realizing that a lot of what's driving the ideology is a desire to complain. I truly believe a lot of it is fueled by resentment
and envy.
And envy.
And kind of unhappiness. Like, and somebody said yesterday, and it really stuck in my mind. They said that the problem with the social justice ideas is they can never build anything, because in order to build, you have to have love and sacrifice. That things that are built require a certain amount of love for whatever it is that you're trying to build, or that the problem you're trying to solve, and a certain amount of personal sacrifice that you're willing to put in, time, energy, effort, loss. You're willing to sustain that in order to build something. When what we see mostly is anger, resentment, envy, straight up hate, and that can never build anything. That you can't build something out of those impulses.
Yes.
You can only destroy.
So you're making me think of one of the things that helped me look at my ideology differently. So I was in it, by the way, for a long time. If you have kids who fall into this cult, I do call it a cult. It meets a lot of cult characteristics, with the exception of having one charismatic leader that you can point to. And so that, I think, throws people off, and they think, well, it can't be a cult. There's not that one guy, there's no Charles Manson or David Koresh, but it doesn't need that one charismatic leader. It still meets a lot of the other characteristics. But so if you have a kid who falls into this cult, they could be in it for a long time. I was in it for 20 years.
Right.
And, one of the things that started to wake me up, there were a few things, but I'll just mention this because you're making me think of it. Somebody had linked, my little online echo chamber had become completely social justice. I had, like a cult, they encourage you to exclude people, family members even. You cut off contact with people who are not believers, who are not woke, who are not part of social justice. They encourage you to view those people as bad or evil, racist, sexist, they call them all these names, and so you're cutting off contact with those people. And in my echo chamber, somebody had shared a Jordan Peterson video, and they called him transphobic. And I went to that video fully expecting to find a transphobe that I could hate on, that, they like going and piling on people. And I went there, and I didn't think he was transphobic at all. I listened to what he was saying. He was making an argument against compelled speech. He wasn't talking about a dislike or disdain for trans people. He didn't even say that he wouldn't use someone's preferred pronouns. It depended
Right.
on the context. And
Right.
so I started listening to more of him because I had already, that wasn't the first thing that started to wake me up. And I had already had some questions. There were other things that happened before that.
Right.
But he was helping me to better understand the things I was noticing that were wrong, that were inconsistent after all these years that I was starting to question about my belief system. And so he has this video. It's an old video. I definitely encourage you to watch it if you're a parent who has a kid who's falling into this. Because it's not explicitly calling out woke, and it might be the kind of thing that they would listen to. It's something interesting. It's an old speech of his, I think from the 80s, and the video was called Tragedy versus Evil. And in it, he was talking about the Cain and Abel story in the Bible. And he was saying, this story is really interesting as an allegory for two different modes of being in the world, two different ways of living. You could look at this story, even if you don't believe this actually happened, you can look at it as an allegory. And so you've got Cain, who, what happens in Cain's story? He doesn't make the necessary sacrifices, or he doesn't make sacrifices that are pleasing to God. But he doesn't make the necessary sacrifices for what he wants. He's entitled. He feels like he's owed everything. He's resentful. He blames all of his problems on his brother, on others, on God. And where does that end up leading him? It leads him to this murderous rage. And then you've got Abel, this other mode of being, which is gratitude. He's grateful. He makes sacrifices. He is not entitled. He's humble. And those two different ways of being in the world, you'll really diverge the older you get if you stay in those ways of being. And so I know I'm talking a lot about this, but this was so impactful to me. I was like, the first time I heard it, I think I was at the gym, and I just listened to it again because I started thinking about social justice and how it's really about behaving like Cain in every interaction in your life.
Sounds like you started to question whether this was a way of living that would lead to you thriving or not. And, you
Right.
know, when you're reading and when you're thinking about that story, you're thinking like, what am I doing here? If this isn't going to lead to my personal, like, it sounds like it almost snapped you out of the collective mindset and into your own mindset and thinking like, is this the kind of person I want to be? And
Yes.
before we get too far, I want to bring that back to this comment here. Thank you for the super chat, Cheeky Mirror. My dad is a math tutor. His hero is Marva Collins, mine too, by the way. He is white. She is black. He saw the trait of great teaching as the trait to emulate. She didn't need to look like him. And this is something I think, you know, going to what you're talking about, when you can break the spell of I'm part of an identity or I'm part of the collective, I'm me. I'm just me, then these identity markers of what race somebody is, what somebody looks like, whether what gender they are, whatever, it's not as important as what they're doing, what kind of person they are. What do I want to emulate how this person is living their life? Do I see, like, I'll hear from other people, they'll say what snapped them out of it is they picked up and read some Thomas Sowell and said like, wait, I want to emulate this guy. I don't want to emulate these people.
Yeah.
But you first have to, something has to break that spell that you're not part of this Borg, and, you know, you're not a white math tutor, you're a math tutor, you know, you're not just a woman, and, you know, like part of the woman group or the social justice warrior group, you're Keri. And when you do that, then it doesn't matter what everything you're looking at with the traits.
You're also taking your power back when you do that.
Yes.
They really, this belief system, if you get really far into it, and again, it's by degrees, like with any cult, I don't think people really realize at first, especially if they're young, how much of their personal responsibility and their ability to actually enact change in their life or the world, if that's what they're concerned with, that they're giving up. It really strips you of that agency. And what you're saying is exactly right. Social justice tells you not just to think of everybody else as what group members they are, what groups are they in, but to think of yourself that way too. Yes. It really, it sucks you of all of your individualism, all of your identity, And you're just this amalgam of your group status.
Right.
That's why if you look at these woke kids on Twitter, they have like 15 different identity group markers in their bio because that's all they are. They don't have a
Right.
personality.
Right.
They have identity groups. That's their personality. I am white, straight, cis, fat, depressed. I'm disabled. And they just list out all the identity groups.
Yeah.
What a poor substitute
Right.
for having an actual personality and an
Right. And
identity.
what's really sad, and I've tried to make this point on the channel before, is if you read any books about verbal abuse, one of the characteristics of verbal abuse, so if you're in a verbally abusive relationship, as an example, one of the markers of the abuse is the way of speaking that attempts to deprive you of your personal power, that essentially attaches responsibilities and obligations to you that are, can be subtle. And there's neuro-linguistic programming that can be used, whatever. And as I read this chapter about verbal abuse, because I kept thinking, I had read this book a long time ago, and I won't say why. And and when all this stuff happened in the last few years, I remember thinking, this is so familiar. This is so familiar. Why is this so familiar? And I went, oh my God. And I went back to the book and I realized these kids, whatever age they are at, or even adults, are in a verbally abusive relationship with whomever is impressing upon them that they're members of these groups. Your identity is this.
Yes.
I am going to tell you that. And if you don't think this way, then you are this other bad identity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's verbal abuse. Because whenever somebody tries to tell you who you are, they're trying to break down your own boundaries and deprive you of your personal power, because one of your most important personal powers is deciding who you are.
Yeah.
That's your decision, not someone else's. Right? So it'd be like if a husband said to a wife, you're my wife and you do this and you cook and you clean and you stay home and you do this. And how is that any different than assigning a person to identity groups? And we would easily recognize that as abusive. We'd say, you don't get to define her. You don't get to say what she has to think, what she has to do, what she has to say, what she can't say, who she can't be friends with. Like, we would instantly say that's abuse. But when it's happening to our kids and it's the teacher, or it's happening in college and it's the professor, that's not the first thing that comes to mind, is that person's being abused.
Right.
But they are.
It's also, it's not just the professor. It's the social group. I think that's probably for kids an even bigger part of the problem, is that if they're in a community, let's say at their school or online and on Tumblr or wherever, it's the social pressure from their peers.
Exactly.
I remember there was a study done a few years ago about how kids, it was over 50% of college kids said in a study that they were afraid of saying what they thought about things.
Yep.
They weren't afraid of what their professor would think. They were, but not to the degree they were afraid of what their peers would think. Mm-hmm. And so it's that whole conformity thing about allowing your peer group to influence the way you think about yourself, the way you define yourself. And you're exactly right. It becomes this sort of abusive relationship where you're making yourself small and to try and fit in and to show that you're a good person because everyone around you has accepted that this is the belief system to do that. And yeah, it really strips you of any personal autonomy or individualism. And sometimes I look at these kids and I'm like I was at a thrift store a couple months ago in Austin, mm-hmm. Keep Austin weird. It used to be kind of hippie, and it was cowboy and biker culture, and Willie Nelson and music capital of the world and all this stuff. Well, now it's become very woke, very conformist. Right. And I was in this thrift store and there were these 3 kids in line, I don't know, high school or college age, and they all looked exactly the same. They were all some kind of, at least what they were trying to signal is that they're non-binary. They were all genderqueer in some way, I'm sure. They all had the brightly colored hair, the piercings, the tats, and they all had a mask. And it was just like, you are trying so hard not to conform, to society's standards, right? But look at you. Look at the society you're in. Look at the echo
Right.
chamber you're in. You are the
Right.
biggest conformist. Like there's
Right.
nothing about you that I don't look at that kind of a college age kid and go, wow, what a free thinker. It's the opposite. Do you know people think this? I didn't say
Right.
anything to them, but I was just wondering, like, nobody's looking at you and thinking, wow, that person really thinks for themselves. It's
Well,
like,
and the thing is,
no.
we can all in every generation can think back to the groups, right? The jocks and the this and the that and the goth and the whatever. But we like the hippies. But here's the difference that I see between the standard rite of passage of adolescents and college age kids to find their little tribe and kind of conform with their dress and stuff and do it, and what the woke stuff does. They've attached, and you made this point earlier as far as it being cult like, they've attached a virtue. So not only is there only one appropriate cult to belong to, but it's the only way to be a good person.
Yes.
So we wouldn't have said in the past that, like, you might look at the hippies and go, oh, those little hippies or whatever, they're druggies, or oh, look at the jocks, whatever. But you wouldn't have said, like, the only way to be a decent human being worthy of life, like literally worthy to be respected and have their rights respected and be able to speak freely and all that, which is a right. It was jocks or something. Like, we wouldn't
Right.
have done that. In fact, you would
Yeah.
have said, like, wait, that sounds vaguely like Jim Crow and racism. Like,
Yeah.
that sounds really extremist. And yet here we are.
Here we are. You're right. It's almost this merging that's happened between just like the natural tribes and communities that form in adolescence, where people try and find identity within a group, and then they've put a religious element on it.
Right.
And so there's a lot of things at play. That's why on Deprogrammed, I've been doing it for 3 years now. But it is, as you said, it is a new channel. I was doing it on Safe Space for a while. But I've been able to have these conversations for 3 years because there's so many things involved in why this happens. Right. It's psychological. It has to do with philosophy. It has to do with I think spirituality and God. There's so many different ways to look at, like, why is this a phenomenon and why did it take off and go mainstream? When I was pushing it, it was a little different because it wasn't culturally dominant like it is now.
Right.
And so back then it was easier to think that, yeah, I'm resisting. I'm fighting the patriarchy. This is not cool. I mean, it's cool because it's not cool. It's cool because it's not part of the mainstream. And now I don't know how kids are convincing themselves of that, because now it is the dominant. McDonald's is speaking woke. Why do you want to speak what these corporations are speaking?
Right. At least the opposite. Right.
Right. At least when I was coming up, I could be like, look, you stupid corporations. You're not woke. But now they're woke. So what's the appeal? That part of it still doesn't make sense to me. I'm like,
well, unless they've gotten what some previous generations, especially those who've had their brains scrambled in terms of, they didn't get a chance to develop any kind of critical thinking skills of their own. So it wasn't just, I want to adapt my outward appearance to this group, but it's also like, I literally don't have a thought in my head. Like, I won't know who I am. I'm hollow, as Jeremy Adams wrote in his book. I think it's called Hollowed Out, about this generation, and that they're terrified, and it's why they react so violently if you criticize something about one of their identity markers or whatever, because they're nothing else inside.
Correct.
They don't have anything else going on.
Correct. And I think it makes people, well, it's unhealthy psychologically for a number of reasons. One is because your identity becomes so merged with the ideology. As you said, there's nothing going on, and there's this deep-seated sort of background anxiety that a lot of these people have. You're more prone to emotional outbursts, outrage, everything triggers you. And the belief system, social justice, it encourages that. It encourages this sort of, I think, emotional instability that you're looking at the world as this oppressive place that's out to get you because of what group status you have. And if you go into the world like that every day, I went into the world like that, where when I say it's a belief system, it's not just like well, I believe these things to be true. Racism equals prejudice plus power. And,
Mhm.
you cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. Like all these different phrases and stuff they have. Silence is violence. But it actually impacts the way you behave in the world, because you go out in the world and you're like, well, that happened to me because I'm a woman. You're primed to look at every interaction, even the smallest things. They teach this. They say uh, the question in any situation is not, was racism at play? It's how was it at play?
Mhm.
They tell you to just assume all the time that racism is at the root of everything. Sexism is at the root of everything,
Check
and
your
it's your job.
check your internal bias, but assume this.
Yes, exactly.
Make these 25 assumptions about people, but check your internalized
Right.
bias.
And then because of the social pressure, I mean, think about some of these kids. So you've got that pressure to conform within the social group. You're being told this is the way to be a good person. Everyone around you believes it. And
Right.
then you start to self-censor. This is human nature too. You almost don't need the group anymore to keep you in line, because you start to develop this internal censor in your head where every word that you utter or type online, you're monitoring it yourself to make sure that you don't accidentally, unintentionally trip some wire that causes your social group to pile on you. This happened prior to social justice going mainstream. I mean, in my online communities, this happened all the time. It was constant infighting and warring. Like, they don't have friends, they have allies. They have ideological allies, and they will turn on you in a second if you say the wrong thing. It's like, because they have to show they're a good person by being part of the mob that piles on you and educates you. So if you say something, this is an example I use a lot because some people haven't heard this one, which is surprising because this one got pretty big for a while. But there was I saw somebody get piled on because they said Elizabeth Warren is my spirit animal. Now, this is a social justice person saying this online, but their own community jumped on them. Spirit animal is racist now. Spirit animal is appropriating Native American culture, and you're not aware of your white privilege and using that phrase. And then there's lots of genuflecting and apologizing. And I'm so sorry, I didn't intend that. I won't use that phrase anymore. And so now what happens to that little sensor in your head? Now you've got another box to check off. Anytime you say something, make sure I don't say spirit animal. There's a whole list that you put it through, this filter, before you even utter a word.
And I think it affects people who wouldn't consider themselves social justice warriors or woke either, because when you see the reactivity of people who are, and how they want to cancel you and they want to get you to lose your job and they want to, do all these things to you, that even if you think they're full of it and you don't agree with it, it's really hard to stand up for yourself. I mean, it's really hard to just say, I'm going to just say what I want to say and do what I want to do. You have
Yeah.
to be independently employed or independently wealthy. You need to feel like really sure of yourself and sure of all your other relationships to take that kind of stand these days, even if you see it as what it is.
Yeah.
And so, as you pointed out, it's a means of controlling, thought control and behavior modification for everyone.
Yes.
And I think it's important too that you pointed out that they don't have friends, because I want parents to hear this. When you look at your kids and their social interactions, I've had parents ask me all the time, like, well, what about socialization? I wouldn't want to pull my kid out of school because then they won't have any friends. And I'm like, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news here, but are you sure they have friends now?
Yeah.
Like, what's your definition of friend? See, all of our definitions have changed. Like what a good person is, what virtue is, what character is, what racism is. So what friend is, why wouldn't that change too?
Yeah. And they are little, a lot of these people, they're social enforcers, and they're making sure your kid stays in line, and maybe your
Right.
kid is making sure they stay in line.
And yeah, and maybe the socialization, maybe I don't want my kid to feel weird. Maybe they're feeling weird every single day, being in a situation where the sands are constantly shifting beneath them and they don't know, like, if it's okay to be. I mean, my eldest daughter experienced this. It wasn't okay to be straight.
Yeah. Oh
I
yeah.
mean, her best friend was not, and aligned herself with the club, right? The GSA club, and LGBTQ, blah blah blah. In fact, they took over the creative writing club. It was supposed to be a creative writing club, and my daughter joined it. And the GSA members basically came in and so dominated it and took it over that she was literally the only cis straight person there. And they were relentless, like
Yeah.
relentlessly bullying her to the point where she left the club, even though she was there to do creative writing, because she just said, I can only be me. Like, I mean, this is who I am. But she was the one on the outs.
There's that pressure. So if you think of it again, like it's an ideology that says the best way to look at the world is as this competition for power between identity groups. And like Marxism, they divide these groups into oppressor or oppressed. And they also interchangeably will use the words privileged or marginalized.
Yep.
And so within the ideology, if you're in a social system that upholds social justice, let's say your kid's school, let's say they're all woke. So within that culture, it's better for you if you can check off more of the oppressed groups, more of the marginalized groups.
Right. The
Because
intersectional
yes,
matrix thing. Yeah.
yes, that's you get more of a voice. They'll tell you if you're white to shut up and listen. You know, if you're a man, shut up and listen. They will rob you of your voice and your agency. Why? They justify it because they say you're an oppressor. You have power. You're privileged. You have power. So human nature would say, well, if you're operating within a little community that believes in this, where you have more power to express yourself, if you have more of these marginalized groups that you check off, well, humans are going to start to check off. They're going to find ways to check off more marginalized groups. They're not comfortable yet with people saying, I've changed race, I'm trans race. That's going to happen one day. We're going to start to see more Rachel Dolezals eventually.
No doubt.
But they're not comfortable. They're not allowing that yet. But they are allowing any type of queer, LGBT, transgender. That's why you're seeing this explosion. Because now, what better way to say, hey, look, I may be a white man, but I am at the top of the oppressed hierarchy because I am trans and I am non-binary and I am queer and I am all these things. And that's also why you're
I
seeing
have 5 or 6 mental illnesses that I'm going to broadcast to the world now because apparently that's okay too.
That's the other reason. So there's these never-ending development of other categories that they can then say oppressed, oppressor. And they're coming up with more of these categories of identity, the group status, because again, you want to have the oppressed group status. So now people are saying, hey, mental health justice. Those of us who have mental health problems, we're oppressed. Okay, I'm depressed and I have anxiety and I'm borderline and I'm not narcissistic. And they're listing these things. And kids, I found this thing online a couple of weeks ago, and some people thought it was a meme. It wasn't. It was real. It was from a 15-year-old's Tumblr, and she's in a whole community of other young woke people who are now talking about. It's evolved to the point where they're talking about narcissistic personality disorder as a marginalization. So I'm claiming that. And they have a flag for narcissistic personality disorder.
Oh my God.
They're calling it narco-gender. And it's like, it's a person whose gender cannot be defined without the context of having NPD. And we are a special marginalized kind of gender because we also have this personality disorder. And that makes us extra high on that oppressed list, right? That's happening. And then there are kids in there. This is going to sound crazy if parents haven't been down the Tumblr rabbit hole, but there's kids in there now who are saying, hey, I've got DID, dissociative identity disorder. That's what they used to call multiple personality disorder. There's
Which is exceedingly rare.
Exceedingly rare, but they're all now saying, hey, I've got this too. I have multiple personalities. I'm a system. I have 5 different personalities. One is trans, one's a ghost, one's a fictive, which is what they call when one of their personalities is based on a fictional character. And you will refer to us as we and they. And now you're talking to this personality. And this is not, I know it sounds silly, but these kids are falling into
it doesn't sound silly. It sounds terrifying.
It's terrifying.
Actually. I mean, if you're a parent listening to this and you're thinking, that'll never happen to my child. I've interviewed parents on this show who had children they were absolutely certain would never, nothing could possibly, they were the most mainstream kids in the world. And then one day they came home and they all said they were trans. And that's just, at this point, sounds vanilla compared to what Keri's talking about.
You're
I
just
mean, now
trans.
you're kind of like hoping just trans. Oh my God, thank you. At least you're not, a fictive. And
Right.
I don't mean to make light of this. This is very
It
serious.
is.
One of the things, getting back to the idea of sort of a cult, one of my locals members mentioned Gnosticism and said that this is kind of like a Gnostic sort of a faith, if you want to look at it that way, in that they have secret knowledge. That's, because that sort of
Yes.
character, like they have secret knowledge that you don't have. And so one of the appeals is not just that this fills up the hollow space of I need meaning in my life. This gives me lazy virtue. I mean, like I can outsource my morality. I can outsource, anything that has to do with being a good person to the group, and redistribute my responsibility to being good, to just having a bunch of traits, which are like a costume I can put on. I can dye my hair. I can put on different clothes. I can, whatever. And now what they're saying is, and I know things you don't know, so that you can't challenge me. It's
Correct.
not just that you shouldn't challenge me or that will make you a bad person, but you effectively can't, because you don't know what I know. I have special knowledge. And it feels like they're moving in that direction where they're getting to this mystical level with some of the stuff. And
Absolutely. Well, they also, I think every parent should know, if your kid is speaking woke now, everything that they're learning in this belief system, all words are just tools for manipulation, not for communication.
Right.
For them, they look at them as tools for manipulation, and everything that they're being taught is used to help those who are in the cult, shut down communication and shut down any criticism and any questions, any discussion at all. So it's like an orthodoxy. It's only the belief system is allowed. And look at all the phrases that they have adopted. What you're talking about, where they say this sort of special knowledge, they call that lived experience, my truth. You don't get to argue with lived experience. And they'll use that as examples. And people probably heard, if you're having a conversation about race and you're not speaking the ideology or the some of the beliefs of the ideology about race,
right.
then if you're white, then they say, oh, well, you don't get to argue with lived experience of Black people. You don't get to speak on this. That's your white privilege. We have special knowledge. Now, if you point out, hey, this Black person over here doesn't agree with you either.
Right.
They have lived experience that doesn't agree with yours. And they're like, well, they're a tool of yours. They're a tool of white supremacy. They're being used. They take the agency from that Black person and say, that's not their opinion. They've just adopted that from you're using them. All Black people agree with us. Well, not that one or that one or that one, but all the
good ones.
Yes.
All the real ones. All the ones worth
Right.
talking to, and that we aren't going to block and stonewall and get and interfere with and all that. And it's, I think the frustrating thing for a lot of parents is that it's so transparently wrong, right? Like incorrect in terms of how the world really works. It's so transparently oppressive, like the opposite of what it says it's going to be. It is. And yet they have done such a phenomenal job of constructing this cult, this ideology, whatever, that breaking in is really, really hard.
Yes.
Now, you've made one suggestion as far as the Jordan Peterson video. What other kinds of things can you think of, if anything, that parents can do to try to sort of break the spell or get through to their kids? I mean, obviously, I would never advocate that somebody say, don't be this way, because that's never going to work.
Right.
But it feels to me like they're under a spell. And when you described what happened to you, it was like something got through a crack, like something kind of broke the spell, put you back inside yourself, and made you more protective of your own perception of things than of your membership in this
Yes.
group.
That's a great way of putting it. In my case, it was emotional, and so I started waking up in 2016 during the presidential election, and I believed a lot of things about Trump that I no longer believe. Not that I think he's I still think he's a narcissist, but I believe that he was back then, a lot of the lies about, he's a demagogue and he's he's racist and he's sexist and he's homophobic and he's going to put people in camps and he's a real, they compared him to a famous fascist dictator, and I believed a lot of that, and I also believed the media plays a big part in this now, because the media is I think they've always been engaged in propaganda, but now they've adopted woke as part of their propaganda as well. Right. And I believed that Trump fans were the violent ones. That was just right. Kind of even though I hadn't seen anything, that's just one of these beliefs that gets pushed, and you start to adopt these opinions that you don't realize are not your own. They're just the opinions of your group. And what happened was I went down a rabbit hole on YouTube of videos of people on my side, good people, leftists, attacking Trump voters. And I had never seen those videos before. And this was at a time, 2016, it was before YouTube had really clamped down on the algorithm. And so you used to get recommended, well, if you watch that video, then watch this one and now they've really tweaked that. So you mostly just get CNN clips now. But back then it was a lot of user uploaded videos, and I was just watching scene after scene of these people coming out of Trump rallies and being assaulted. And one girl who a mob had pushed her up against a door and was throwing eggs at her. Another one, these guys were coming out of the Trump rally and they got chased and hit with a brick. This guy was bleeding. It was like watching this and being so assaulted with something that was the exact opposite of what I was being told by the media really shook my foundations of faith. But it didn't change me overnight. I just didn't know how to process that. And it left me in tears. I watched a lot of these, and I really thought at first, as I started thinking about things over the next few months, it was like, if I can figure out how to articulate this the right way to my tribe, I can help them see what I've seen. This is wrong. Let me figure out how to best explain this. This is violence. This is not right. This is not liberalism. And in trying to do that, I was pushed further out. It was, I didn't realize yet at that point that I was in a cult. It was like, well, these people are all good intentioned. They all have good intentions too, Right. And if they just watch this, I was like, look at these videos. And what I would get in the comments was, that's cherry picked and that's a misrepresentation. And this is the true reality is this, da, 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 da. And it was this real resistance to hear what I was saying. Mm-hmm. And let me get back up. So in answer to your question, there's a great book. I would highly recommend. This book helped me understand a lot. It's Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind. Okay. And he's asking in that book, how is it that good people can be so divided by politics and religion and truly believe that they're the moral ones? And I like it because he's trying to help us better understand the psychology behind how this happens and how we can have such different views, but be fully convinced that we're on the side of good and the other people on the side of evil. And in that book, one of the things he talks about is how we tend to make decisions with our emotional mind. Mm. And social justice people especially. I think there's a large percentage of people in social justice who are emotionally minded. And so it wasn't, nobody gave me a list of facts and nothing like that. It wasn't my rational mind. It was my emotional mind being touched by what I was seeing. And that opened my mind up a little. So then I started receiving information. I couldn't receive information before that. If you had said, read this article about, let's take an issue. So the left will say, people on the right are evil because they don't want us to raise the minimum wage. And they don't care about people because why wouldn't you want us to raise the minimum wage and pay people more? And if you had sent me an article making the case that, well, hey, people on the right don't want us to raise the minimum wage because they care about people too. And they think raising the minimum wage is going to put people out of work and cause layoffs and cause people to cut their staffs. And it's going to have a negative impact on people. That's why they don't support it. If you had sent me that, I would have said, first thing, that's the Daily Wire. I'm not reading that. Like,
right, exactly.
Or wherever it came from. It's like, no. They have. But
if somebody sent you a video showing like a single mom who just got fired because hiking the minimum wage meant that her boss could only afford,
There you go, Deb.
could only afford like 2 employees and she was the last one hired, and the others had other issues, and then you had the employer crying and saying, I wish I could continue to employ this person, but the law says I have to pay this and I just can't afford it, and it's my family business and I'm supporting my own 3 kids. And like, if you had seen that scenario, you'd be like,
Yes.
whoa.
Conservatives, I will say this as a liberal who's been observing conservatives up close now for a couple years. They're not good at storytelling. No,
Horrible.
they don't know how to
Absolutely awful.
personalize things as well as liberals know how to tell a story and personalize it. And they, there's another great book. Oh gosh, Love Your Enemies, and I'm blanking on the guy who wrote it, but some author. Anyway, in the book, he talks about how when he was working for a nonprofit, he had to raise a lot of money for fundraising. And if he were to go out and just say, here are the stats on homelessness, poverty, hunger, here are the stats on hunger in this African country, we appreciate your donation. He's like, no, stats, cold, hard stats, they don't touch a person's heart. That's why you see the stories where they're like, this is,
Right.
this is a Jama or whoever. His story. He doesn't have food to eat. And they personalize it. And I would say that's something that conservatives could stand to do.
That's
a little
why
better.
we see the little puppies in the cage for the
Yes.
animal stuff. Oh my God. I don't care who you are. Like, you're going to be touched by that. So, it's a lesson that people need to learn, because the left is really good at it. Always has been. And the tragedy of it is that I don't actually believe that the people behind the messaging, in other words, the corporate one, the ones that are doing the corporate messaging behind woke ideas and university messaging, but I actually don't believe they are truly caring, empathetic people.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. I think they are quite ruthless and single-minded and focused, and their focus is power. And I think that what they know how to do is manipulate the mass of well-meaning people to do their bidding.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, history teaches us that, whether it's Mao or Pol Pot or Stalin or Hitler, these people didn't care. They might have said they cared, but they leveraged the caring and the concern and the fears and the hopes and the dreams of others. And it's like the oldest trick in the book. And that's why I said it's like being in a verbally abusive relationship. That same person who would try to deny you agency and say, you are this person because I said so, and I'm, I'm going to be the one bold enough and ballsy enough to do it. That same person doesn't care about you. They'll say they do. They'll say, I'm just trying to help you be a better person.
Yeah.
Happens in relationships all the time. I'm just trying to you're just falling apart at the seams. You need me to tell you these things, because if I didn't tell you these things, you would be a basket case.
I'm doing
Thank God for you that you have me.
Yeah. That's I mean, look at
relationship abuse 101.
Look at the people who are so as we said, there's not one single charismatic leader of social justice, but there's several, what my friend Gracie West calls the high priests and priestesses of the movement.
Yes.
And Robin DiAngelo is a great example. Yeah. This is a woman who makes bank off of pushing this belief system and convincing mostly I would say other white women that this is the way to be a good person in the world, is to divide and judge people and treat people differently on the basis of race, that somehow that's the way to end racism. And she preys off of the good intentions of others. She's a total con artist. Yeah. You see the snake oil salesmen, they're the ones that rise to the top. They're Brett Weinstein. There's another good video I would recommend. Brett Weinstein did a video called How the Magic Trick is Done. This is a few years old now. This is back when he was going through the social justice mobbing at Evergreen College. And, he's progressive, had spent his life in anti-racist movement, and suddenly he was being called this racist right winger, and because he didn't
It's
agree
so
with treating
ridiculous.
people differently on the basis of race. It's like, wait a minute, that's racist. So in this video, how the magic trick is done, he talks about, it's been a while since I've seen it, but he sort of divides the people who are in this ideology into two groups: the bad actors and the useful tools. The bad actors do not have good intent. They are using this belief system the same way any con artist uses any belief system. They're using it for money, power, the ability to hurt others, to gain things for themselves, riches, worldly success, what have you. And then the useful tools is people like, I was a useful tool. I was manipulated by this belief system. I'm not giving up my responsibility here, by the way. Sometimes I'll hear people be like, oh, you talk about how you were brainwashed and you're not taking I'm taking full responsibility for what I did. I'm trying to help others, I guess, understand how people fall into it and how they're not all the same. There are people in it who sincerely believe in it like I did. And we go out and we would try to help it make sense. Like help make sense of a belief system that has so many internal contradictions. We were very useful in spreading these new definitions of words. And, well, no, that's not racist because racism doesn't actually mean what you think it means. It means this, and it's impossible to be racist towards white people. So there you go. Like,
Just redefine the word, and then you can apply it however
yeah,
you want. And I am seeing a lot of these, what I would call them bad actors in the education world, in that they're making a tremendous amount of money. I mean, we're talking billions of dollars, not millions of dollars, billions of dollars, pushing things into school districts in the name of social justice. And while it may seem watered down in the sense that they don't put into the curriculum materials the same invective and harsh rhetoric that you were hearing as a person on the receiving end of it interpersonally, it's the same ideology. It's the same, you young child, and this was probably done to you in college. You are responsible to fix the planet. You're responsible to fix society. You're responsible to fix other people, which again is another thing that, back in my day, we were told that's actually child abuse. Telling a child they're responsible, telling any human that they're responsible to fix other people is the exact opposite of A, something that's true and possible, and B, it's abusive, it's boundary violating.
yeah,
You wouldn't do that to somebody who looks up to you as a person in a position of authority or power over them. And yet that's exactly what we're doing. And so I can't find the good in that. I don't think there's any good intention in a program, for example, like transformative SEL, that seeks to teach children that they have a responsibility to the collective.
correct.
Just can't see that.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to remember who it was I heard talking about this. It might have been Jonathan Haidt. I heard him speak once. And yes, he was talking about there's two different ways to look at the university system. But I guess you could talk about all of education now. I guess because this is in K through 12 now. Is the goal to teach kids how to think?
Right.
Or is it to teach them what to think? And he's like, you can look at it. I think he was comparing the way John Locke would look at it, if I'm getting that right. It's been a while since I've thought of this, versus Marx. And so one
Natural
way of
law versus
right, and one way of looking at it is you're teaching people how to think.
Yep.
And the other way of looking at it is, no, you're teaching them how to be an activist, what to think and how to go out and enact change. The Marxist view is like the purpose of university is to turn you into these little foot soldiers. The social justice view is the purpose of university is to shape you into these activists who are going to go out and change the world. And that's exactly the way I left college. And that was over 20 years ago. It's worse now. But all of my cohorts, the people who came up at the time I did in similar schools, like we went into careers where we took the ideology with us. That was our mission. It was take this and enact change in the world. And that's why you see all of, the seeds were planted then, and you see all of this now becoming culturally dominant because there were so many people like me who took it into their fields, into entertainment, into media, journalism, politics, tech. you've got Google is overcome by this ideology because people
Yeah,
are
you know,
learning
we
it in
saw
school and
it
moving in.
that we first saw it with that guy, and his name escapes me, but the one who wrote that
James
memo.
Damore.
Yeah. And I remember at the time thinking it was bold of him to do. I mean, it was kind of like, wow, this guy has guts. Um, but looking back on it now, and I think that was really the first, that's like one of the first events we can sort of pinpoint and say this was the beginning of the visible takeover of this in the corporate world,
Yes.
because the reaction to him was so outsized to
Totally
reality
agree. Yes.
that it was like bizarre.
We saw a lot of those canaries in the coal mine. He was one in tech. Brett Weinstein was one, the university level.
Yep. Evergreen. Yep, for sure.
There have been so many of those who are like, this is what's happening, this is what's coming. When I first started talking about this stuff, so my process of leaving was pretty long. It's not like an overnight thing. And I would say about 2 years, 2016, 2017 is when I was grappling with what do I really believe and trying
Right.
to understand my ideology better. And I had a lot of fear about leaving. Once I had decided, no, I know what I think now, and this is wrong. And this
Right.
belief system that I've been invested in for so long is the exact opposite of what I thought it was. It's like a betrayal
Yeah.
of you're finding out that this, it's like finding out a person that you let close to you for so long is not who they said they were. It's like there's all these
Ex-
emotions that you're going through.
And
And
I can't imagine. Well, actually, I can't imagine because it's similar to, but it would be only one person. I can't imagine what that feels like when it's your entire friend group
yeah.
or like, all your colleagues and, the basically the life you've built for yourself is around people that you can't change their minds and you no longer agree with them in a way that is fundamental.
Oh yeah, it's fundamental is the correct word. It's at the very basic level of what is your house of belief constructed on.
Right.
And that's why I think psychologically it's so hard for people to leave a cult of belief because everything is built on that foundation. They've built their
Yeah.
whole life, their whole social circle, sometimes their career, everything they do, their relationships, sometimes their spouse, everybody's a part of it. And so if there's a book called Don't Think of an Elephant by George Lakoff. This is a book that I read when I was a leftist. It's by a leftist for leftists to better understand conservatives. There's some big blind spots in the book because he doesn't realize it could go the other way too.
Right.
But one of the things he talks about is the way that our belief system is like a house, an entire house with a foundation. And if
Right.
you're talking to someone who has a certain belief system that's different from yours and you give them a fact that doesn't fit with their architecture, that's why they discard the fact. It just doesn't fit. They can't put that window in the house. It doesn't go with it. They would have to tear the whole house down to the
Right.
root, to the boards. They'd have to start all over. And that's a huge process. I had to raise my whole house of belief to the ground and then start brick by brick with what do I believe? Let me construct a new house and figure out what do I actually believe? What's not a received opinion that I've just accepted as fact without really
Right.
investigating it. And that, first of all, that takes a long time because now I mean, seriously, you're, well, do I believe racism is prejudice plus power? Okay, let's start there, and then you're like reconstructing this thing. But that's hard. It's emotional. I know
Well, and
people
you have to
let,
fill in gaps too, because
yeah,
all the time that you spent in college where they were, teaching you things like that, racism is, race plus power, that was time not spent exposing you to a different point of view.
oh
And
yeah,
so, there are people there's been a movement for quite some time to sort of ban the teaching of CRT in K-12. And I I mean, I agree with it in the sense that I don't think there's any redeeming features of critical race theory, and I don't think you could teach in a critical I don't think you can teach critical pedagogy alongside of other pedagogy. First of all, there's no time. Second of all, it'll be massively confusing. And third, it runs completely counter to American, the American system and American ideals. So I don't know why you would, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm against it, but I'm a free speech absolutist. So it's like very hard for me to say, you teacher, the only thing I could say is like, you've got to try to be neutral in the classroom. But I don't love, especially at the college level, I don't think you can ban things. I mean, you have to allow for this exploration, but I really wish we could get more momentum behind, I don't want to call it balance because there's no such thing, but at least encouraging and possibly even, I wouldn't say forcing isn't the right word, but evaluating professors on this basis of how well they do this. Okay. So if you don't do it very well, your evaluation won't be so good from your peers or university, that you need to expose your students to different points of view. Like you can't construct an entire women's studies program from one political lens, ideological lens. There are women and have been women who have written and talked about what the life of a woman is like in Western society or Eastern society, whatever societies you're looking at, from all different points of view. Okay. If you read Zora Neale Hurston, you're going to get a very different point of view than if you read, Angela Davis. Okay. Or like somebody else. So why wouldn't you have your students compare and contrast? Why wouldn't you allow them to wrestle with these different ideas and come to their own conclusions? Well, the answer is obvious, because you don't want them to. You want them to come to the conclusion that you want them to come to. And so when you had to go through your transition, it's not like you had a reservoir of other ideas to go back to and go, all right, maybe these make more sense now that it's empty.
It's empty.
Nothing there.
They do a good job of, you don't interact with other ideas.
Right.
And part of that is that internal censor that you develop that I mentioned, but you mentioned Thomas Sowell earlier. I never heard of Thomas Sowell until I started leaving my cult of belief. He's not taught in any of the critical race theory classes, any African American history. Like, they really push people to the outside of this belief system, and then they make you afraid to interact with them. Like I said, if somebody had given me a Daily Wire article back then, I would have engaged in genetic fallacy immediately. You're taught to do that, even if you don't know what genetic fallacy means. That's what you're doing. You're saying, I'm not going to engage with that because of the source. I'm not even going to read it. And they cut off, it's like a rat in a maze, and they cut off all the exits. So you're really just on one path and that's it. You're not supposed to interact. It's bad. Why would you watch a Ben Shapiro video? Why would you listen to read Thomas Sowell? And some of these people, if they become big enough that you hear about them, like Ben Shapiro, they make him an unperson that you're not supposed to interact with anything he says. And so you have passionate opinions about someone who you've never listened to. But then other people like Thomas Sowell, they don't even have to do that. He doesn't even exist to a lot of social justice people. They've never even heard of him. So they don't have to make him radioactive, because they've done a good job of just memory holing him.
Which is just, and part of the reason for that possibly is that he was a Marxist in his younger years. And because he was more committed to empiricism than Marxism, when he arrived at business school, or I should say not business school, but he arrived at graduate school rather, and was studying economics under people like Milton Friedman and so forth. And because he was committed to empiricism, he was like, I'll go where the data takes me. I'll go where the information takes me. And it took him right away from Marxism, because it pointed out all the problems and how it didn't work in the real world. And it just, Marx got a lot of the fundamentals wrong. And so that just disabused him of Marxism, because he was willing to follow the facts. And he made a point once where he said, if your goal is to help people, and I'm going to get this paraphrasing wrong, but if your goal is to help people, how could you be successful at that if you weren't starting with facts? If you weren't starting with reality, then whatever you're going to come up with in the end isn't going to be helpful. Yeah. Because you're trying to help someone who's living in reality, right? And so a person like Thomas Sowell is the last person they want to expose college students to, because you might follow along his intellectual development and arrive at similar conclusions, or at least follow his process. And of course,
Yeah.
empiricism isn't
Yeah.
what they want you doing.
Yeah. Well, that would be a suggestion I would say, you know, also is you could try to get, if you have a kid who's falling into woke, you could try to get them to read someone like Thomas Sowell. They may not, they may react, they may already have been, the well may have been poisoned enough that they look at him and say, no, I've heard about him and he's one of the black people I'm not supposed to listen to.
It just seems so crazy to me.
But they do
So
that.
what you're
I
saying
mean,
is your mind is closed. Right.
right. Right. But sometimes, depending on the person, they, especially if they're well intentioned and they're in it because they sincerely believe some of the tenets, you can use some of the social justice tenets against them in a way, or try and
Right.
hold them to those. So they do say within the ideology that white people need to shut up and listen to black voices. So you could say, here's a black voice. Like, would you mind reading this book? And maybe I'll read one of your books. Maybe I'll read your white lady Robin DiAngelo book if you read my black man Thomas Sowell book.
Oh my
They
God.
might, if they're sincere enough, they might take you up on it. The ones who
Right.
are pretty far in it, though, if they've heard, no, I'm not reading your right. He's a tool for white supremacy, you know. I'll
Right.
stick with my
Exactly.
white lady.
Or, his ego brain says instead they'll go see what the left has to say about soul and parrot that. They do
Yes.
that a fair amount.
Yeah.
Now I would love to have a lot of hope that parents would be able to approach their kids and somehow find an inroad or whatever. But realistically speaking, if they're pretty far down the rabbit hole or in the maze or whatever, it's unlikely so. And I realize that you don't have your kids yourself, but having been a college kid and been through this, maybe you have some insight to offer in terms of how can parents continue to have healthy relationships with children they don't like. And I hate to put it that way, but I mean, when it comes right down to it, and I know Jordan Peterson says, don't ever let your kids do something that makes you not like them. But that's advice you give to someone who has a little kid.
Yeah.
You got to start there. If you miss those first 7 years of really getting those values and exposing them to things in such a way that they are an independent thinker, if somehow that didn't gel, it's a rare one amongst us who loves everything about our teenagers, even when that was in place. So there you are. You're face to face with your child that might be living under your roof still, or you're paying their tuition in college, and they are actively fighting against everything you hold dear, everything that you are. They're saying things to be nonsense, and you don't want to lose your child. You don't want to lose that relationship, but you also need to be. You don't want to enable. It almost feels like, how do you counsel someone who has a drug addict as a child?
Yeah.
It feels like
Yes.
I'm asking that question because they sound similar to an addict. They're engaging in things that are self-destructive, that are destructive to the people around them, and yet you don't want to lose them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know. What can you do?
I heard from a young man once who told me that he fell into woke at college much later. He's a lot younger than me, so it's much more recently. And he started coming home from school and calling his dad a white supremacist and part of the patriarchy, and having these head-to-head arguments with his dad. And he said that he tried to cut his dad off. Now, not entirely, because his dad was paying for his school and everything, but he said his dad never stopped loving him. He did not shy from disagreeing with him, but he would do so lovingly. He let him know that he disagreed with what his son was saying, and he would ask him questions. He was always asking him questions and trying to get him to think just by. And people want a lot of your kid, sometimes they want to talk about this belief system. Take advantage of that. Ask them to explain it. Ask them to explain, well, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? And because you might ask the right question that there's so many internal contradictions in the belief system. You might lead them to one of those contradictions just by asking a question rather than pointing it out to them. Don't point it out to them. Ask them about it. But he said his dad kept asking questions, disagreeing with him, but also loving him. And he never cut him off, even though his son was calling him awful names. And when he came to a place where he, on his own, started to question things, he remembered that about his dad. Mm-hmm. And he came back to him. And so I think there's that balance there between continuing to love, but figuring out how to do that. And you compared it to a drug addict. And I do think there's a degree of tough love there that might be necessary for some kids. It depends on how much they're taking advantage of you while pushing something that's destructive, I guess.
Right. Yeah, like how much you're paying for their existence. Like, there's
Yes.
tuition, car, room and board, insurance, cell phone, things like that. Like after a point, you get somebody sitting there telling you capitalism is evil and whatever. Like, so you won't be needing this phone anymore, I guess.
Right.
Like, I mean,
If I'm paying for everything. Yeah.
Yeah, after a point, it starts getting like,
It's like that. Well, another analogy to an addict is at a certain point, it's like, well, you might have to hit some sort of rock bottom with your belief system where you're like, do I hate capitalism now that I'm having to pay for things myself and figure out how to make my way in the world and acquire things? And I guess I like working for a living. Like they may have to encounter those things to have that wake up call. I'm not sure where the line is. Like you said, I don't have kids yet. I'm trying. But one of the things about growing up late and being in woke, the feminist part of woke ideology in particular for so long was there was this disdain for motherhood. And so I don't talk about that enough, but I feel for people who are getting pulled into it now who, if I could talk to my younger self, it would be like, don't write all of this off as some,
right.
function of patriarchy and women are just being used like chattel and like all of that. Anyway,
There's a lot of push right now for kids to make permanent decisions and choose permanent solutions to temporary problems. Even if we were to assume that there was such a thing called the patriarchy, if you really believe in the greatness of your own ideas to fix it or change it, then why would you assume that by the time you're of childbearing years that you wouldn't be willing and able to have a child and not be somebody's property or whatever the issue is? Like, that sounds very hopeless to me. Like, let's go be activists for a cause we hope to lose. If you're going to say like, I'm a teenager, but I'm disdaining motherhood 10, 15 years from now. It's like, okay, I guess you plan to fail, like that. You're not going to have any, you're also not going to interact with any men who are decent, like,
right.
Like you said, there's so many internal contradictions, but that might be a question a parent might ask and just say like, but I thought you were working on that patriarchy thing. So if you fix it, like, why wouldn't you want to have a kid?
Right.
But maybe your partner will help raise it or what. Like, you could ask questions like that and get them thinking about like, oh yeah, maybe. I mean, but then you have adults who are pushing kids to sterilize themselves effectively.
Yes. Yeah. They are, that's another facet of the belief system is that once you're woke, it's like you're done. It's the opposite of awakening. It's not present tense like awakening. Woke is finished. I know everything. I'm always going to have this belief system. And sure, I'm 16 and I'm going to sterilize myself now and have a double vasectomy. Like they are pushing a lot of permanent decisions on people at a young age. Mm-hmm. And I kind of think of it, in my case, fortunately, like I said, I didn't get hit with all this stuff until college age, but I wonder if I'd been hit with it at a younger age, if I would have even thought, oh, what's my gender? Like, I don't fit with the norm or the stereotype of women in every way, so I guess I'm a man. Like, I don't know. Right. I did at a certain point, I guess, I avoided one of my most regrettable decisions, thankfully. When I was 28, I was going to get a tattoo of the feminist fist in the women's symbol. Oh my God. On my arm. I'm so glad I didn't get that. My ex-husband, he was great. He was like, I don't know, like, what, you're always gonna want that women's symbol there? Yes. It's kind of like what you're saying, Deb, like, are we never gonna win this battle? No. We're forever fighting.
I'll be a 90-year-old woman and we're still going to be angry and, with a fist in the air. It is so frustrating. And this is such a good point too, as adults, know how much our ideas change over time. So it makes it more horrendous that so many are going along and even pushing for this. That's something that I was talking about today. Um, things feel upside down, Keri. They feel like, we're saying kids are responsible to fix things. Kids are responsible to protect adults. Kids will only feel, have mental health when they're perfectly safe, when we actually know that a certain amount of stress and change and so forth is actually good for mental health. Like striving and overcoming and falling down and getting back up is how we become resilient. There's different components to mental health, and safetyism does not produce it.
No.
We talk about the hover parents and, helicopter parents, and we know that they tend to have neurotic children who are anxiety ridden and so forth. And yet you'll have schools going safe space, safe place, safety, safety, safety. And you're like, but if I decide I don't want my kid to go to the mall alone, I'm an overbearing parent. It's like, come
Yeah.
on, this is
Yeah.
craziness. So, it's this weird, like everything's been turned upside down to now where I
I
have
know.
adults saying little bitty kids need to learn about sex. Whereas we adults will be like, if I went back to talk to my younger self, I'll be like, men aren't even worth talking to and having anything to do with until you're like 25. I mean, obviously, I'm exaggerating. You know what I'm saying? Like, I would tell myself, my younger self, all those many, 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 many hours you spent thinking about boys and relationships and sex and this and that and your college years, whatever, was a colossal waste of your time. Where did that end up? Where, any
Yeah.
of those people? Do you remember their names? Like, and I was just talking to my 18-year-old about that the other day. She's already seeing it. She's already like, I kind of wish I could go back and tell my middle school self that like boys are dumb. Like, why did I care about all that? But yet we're saying 6-year-olds need to be told about sexual pleasure. I'm like,
Yeah.
no, the
Yeah.
opposite.
We are in an upside down world. There's a couple of Bible verses about that. I mean, you know, woe to him who calls good evil and evil good. I think we're at one of those times in history, human history, where we've reached that crescendo where everything is completely inverted.
Yeah.
And that is also related to the abusive relationship dynamics that you're talking about,
Yep.
where
We
up is
even tell
down.
people things that are objectively unattractive
Yes.
are beautiful, right?
Hmm.
And we're demonizing things that are beautiful
Hmm.
and turning it inside out. And this is something I think James Lindsay talks about a lot. Is it's part of the Marxist playbook. It's part of what people do to sort of confuse you, because your eye knows, the human eye wants symmetry. The human brain, like we're biologically and evolutionarily designed for, to be attracted to certain things and to find certain things appealing and so forth. And so when the society says no, it's the inverse of that, there's something in you that feels uncomfortable
Yeah.
accepting that. And that's what they're going for, is
Yes.
the power comes when the people that you want to have power over can't manage themselves. They're spending so much time feeling uncomfortable and like not okay that they're looking for someone else to make it okay.
Yeah.
And in, of course, conveniently steps
And you're
whoever.
giving them this permanent battle that they have to fight. And it's outside of themselves. It's the
Yeah.
all of your problems are the result of this oppression
Right.
that's happening and all of the identity groups you're in. And if only you could fix the world, then you wouldn't have this discomfort, this disease.
Right.
You know,
Right.
they I think that works for a lot of people. It worked for me for a long time.
Yeah.
You relate everything back to sexism, racism, homophobia. It's this constant, like, as you said, this pressure they're putting on kids, and they're teaching them at younger and younger ages that this is the best way to view the world, and you are a little soldier now. And look at what they're doing with the climate change in kids, Greta. Look at what they're doing
Yeah.
with gun control in kids. All the, what's his name? Mr. Harvard, David Hogg.
Oh God. Mr. I'm going to make a better pillow. Oops. I changed my mind.
Gosh, that
Making
kid.
pillows is hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, so are you optimistic that we can kind of turn this thing around, or do you feel like we're going to have to go through to the logical conclusion where things get worse before they get better
Both.
first?
I
Both.
am optimistic, but I do think things have to get even worse than now because Look at what we've seen in the past few years. So in 2016, 2017, when I started waking up, I think that was an acceleration point
Mhm.
where social justice like doubled down. It became more mainstream, and because of that, there were some obvious hypocrisies that became apparent to people like me. And I know lots of people who started waking up around that time. I've, in the past few years of interviewing people, I've met lots of former social justice warriors like myself, and that's very encouraging. But on the other hand, look at all the people who didn't wake up, and even worse, when these acceleration points happen, there's a lot of people who get radicalized, who get pulled into woke, who were not there before, because now
Mm.
it's mainstream and it's their first time interacting with it. And I know people who've woken up, as I said, but I know even more people who went fully woke at that time and are now, I mean, they're where I was at a long time ago. They're fully immersed in it, and I don't fully understand that, because we had that acceleration point in 2016, 2017. We had another one around George Floyd. That's when all the corporations really went big time woke. And so it's gotten to such a kind of a circus level of insanity that I do look at the people who are in it now and can't see it as like, what is wrong with you? Like Patton Oswalt, comedian. Let's talk about someone in the public eye. Patton Oswalt, comedian. What's wrong with you? You used to be normal. And
Right.
can you not see, can you not
Right.
see what all the internal contradictions, all the hypocrisy, down is up is down, what's going on? And
Right.
because those people are still so fully invested in the cult, I do think it's going to have to get worse before
Right.
the majority starts to turn away from it. And
Mhm.
what does that mean? Things get worse. I think we'll have to see it. This is, my pastor talks a lot about this whole thing that we're talking about, this culture war, woke, whatever you want to call it, where we're at right now culturally as human beings in the West. He talks about it as a war on reality.
Yeah, for sure.
And at a certain point, reality is going to come calling. You can't battle reality and
Nope.
push it into submission. So what I think that ways in which it might get worse are reality coming to call. Like if we see a terrible economic crisis, if people's daily lives start to be impacted to such a degree that they can no longer live in this cognitive dissonance between the fake reality and the real reality, if they're
Right.
forced to reckon,
Right.
come out of that sleep that you're in and look at this world around you and look at the all the fruits of your belief system, look at the
Right.
consequences of all of this well-intentioned ideology. I
Right.
think I think that has to happen. But I am optimistic because after that happens,
Well, I
well
mean,
then,
reality
yeah.
wins, right? I mean, and like you
Yeah.
said, after that, and I think when you're talking about the people still getting sucked in, one important component for parents to remember is how many of our children are woke adjacent. And I hate to keep co-opting their terms, but what I mean by that is
Yeah.
they're in the unenviable position of having no friends often, or sort of tolerating a certain amount of the woohoo stuff. Like just to give an example, I have a 13-year-old daughter, and she goes and takes this aerial silks class where you do aerial acrobatic type of stuff.
Oh yeah.
And there are at least two kids in that class of maybe 10 or 12 who are, one is non-binary and one is trans, but they're both born female. Okay. And so, she was trying to make friends with these kids. She's very friendly and she tries to be nice to everybody. And she was trying to make plans to have, one or both of these kids over. And what I found interesting, a couple things I found interesting. My daughter was willing to accommodate them in the sense that, one of them wasn't allowed to come over because we weren't vaccinated. And so she said, well, I'll wear a mask and this and that, or maybe we can go outside and go for a walk. And, so my daughter's like making all these accommodations, and the girl's like, no, 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 we can't do that. And then the other one was saying, well, my pronouns are, and I can't remember what the pronouns were, but she came to me and said, I want to have this person over to hang out, but I need to know, are you going to be willing to use their pronouns? And she agrees with me. Like we've had conversations and she agrees with me that this is, it's like she doesn't understand what people are doing, like that's not really a boy, whatever. But she's like, I don't know what's going on with her. I just, she seems nice. He seems nice. I just want to be friends. And I told her, I said, I will refer to the child by their name. That's what I will do, because I don't think I'm going to be talking about them in the third person while they're in my house.
Anyway,
That
yeah.
doesn't make any sense. So I don't think you have anything to worry about. It's perfectly fine. She's like, "Are you going to be weird?" And I'm like, "No, I'm a decent human being.
Yeah.
I treat people kindly, I'm not like nasty. I just, but I kind of was taking her pulse. I'm like, "Well, how do you feel about all this?" And she said, "Mom, I just don't see what the big deal is. I don't know why you even care. It's none of your business. What do you care? It's none of your business." And obviously why I care is that she feels so strongly that she has to accommodate other people. That's why I care. It's not that I'm so put off by the other child. It's that I don't really notice anyone trying to make my child feel comfortable.
Yeah.
And it's not that I would necessarily expect them to, but the demand is all one way, and that's not
Yes.
friendship. So there, as a parent, I'm trying to teach my child about making friends and what to expect from friends. And I'm stymied by this extra complication that if this were just a regular girl saying, "Well, you have to come to my house and you have to do this and you have to do that and you have to accommodate me," it would be a lot easier for me to say to my daughter, "Do you feel like that's a great basis of a friendship, that you have to do all the accommodating?" And we could have that conversation. Well, there's no less reason to have that conversation, but now we're talking about someone who's got extreme health worries because of
Yeah.
COVID, and somebody who's got, they're non-binary and they got pronoun issues. So now that complicates it, because if I say to her, "Why are you making all these these things?" Like, "Because they're this and they're that." And it's really hard to parent when you're bumping up against that, and all you want to do is say, "I don't care." That doesn't change it.
Yeah.
That doesn't give them special protection. They're not wrapped in a special bubble wrap of virtue that makes them, that gives them special privileges to treat you like garbage.
Yeah.
Right? And to expect more from you than you can expect from them. That's not okay. But how do you have the conversation without your kid being like, "You're just," and she's
Yeah.
tempted to be like, "You're just afraid because they're trans." Like, no, I'm not. Right?
Yeah.
And these are conversations I believe that parents are having all over America right now, where
Yes.
they're just like, I want to teach my child courage and agency and boundaries and all these things. And my own kid isn't specifically woke, right? Like, my kid's not walking around spouting this stuff. But this is the dynamic.
Yeah. I would say, well, that's that big heartedness we are talking about, where someone
Exactly.
is trying to accommodate and they're pleasing, they're a pleaser, and they want everyone to feel comfortable. And I think uh, more often than not that you will see that in girls, not exclusively, but girls on average tend to be a little bit more of the pleaser personality. And
Right.
um, I don't know at that age if I could have, if somebody had told me, well, it's important to figure out what you think about these things and have your own boundaries for how people treat you. I don't know if that would have made sense to me. Maybe it would have. It's hard to remember back that far.
I mean,
But
I'm thinking back, and I'm with you. I don't know if it would. So that's kind of what I've fallen back on, is give it time. I've tried to be, I've been uncompromising in the sense of my own values. Like, I've made it very clear to how I feel about a thing. But I've also told her, "Look, you have to ultimately make your own decisions about who your friends are going to be.
yeah,
But if somebody's going to come in my house, there's a limit to the accommodations, because it's my home." And
exactly.
that's how that works. And I hope you would, think the same way about your life, like what was going on. But ultimately, it's up to you. So I've kind of tried to, like, ease her into it, so I don't sound like some dogmatic, like, "Do it my way or you're wrong," because then she'll just rebel anyway. But I do think that the majority of parents are facing what I just described,
The woke adjacent, yeah.
this woke adjacent thing of, like, I'm trying to teach my kid character and boundaries and things in a world of people who are boundaryless and are making demands. They're saying, "Because I am all these list of things, that means you have to do this for me." And you feel disempowered when you want to, as a parent, push back on that. And very often it's coming from the school. So very often, we see it with the push to put, like, porn in the library, or
Yeah.
to teach, sex ed and the thing. Well, some kids have abusive parents. I'm like, some.
Yeah.
but you want to treat my child like I'm abusive. So everything is, we're like all in deference to the woke. It's like this group of people that we're all tippy toeing around and walking in eggshells around, which is another characteristic of abuse.
Yeah. A borderline, that's actually a characteristic of borderline personality disorder,
Right.
where they're
Right.
so emotionally unstable, you have to, you're, everything is fraught with tension of if you say the wrong thing. That's what it was like being a social justice person. It's like that internal censor that you have in your head. I don't want people to take this the wrong way. You know, I
Right.
have to say this the right way. What if I make them mad? What if
This is a
yeah.
good point from Cheeky Mirror. It may not make sense to them now, but you plant the seeds, and that's absolutely correct. Lots of things
Yes.
that I was told that didn't make sense at
Yes.
the time, so it is worth saying. And like I said, I'm trying to find that middle ground as a parent myself, and I'm only being open about my own experience with my kids, in thinking that, if somebody out there is watching this and having a similar experience, and maybe there's something we take from it, maybe not, I don't know, but um for what it's worth. I, there's that. So we're coming up on, I've taken so much of your time, but I do,
Oh,
before we
you're
finish, I want to make sure that we talk a little bit, because you've touched on it slightly, but I don't want to finish this off without making it clear that you went through a grieving process. Is that correct?
yes. So if you do have kids coming out of this, no matter what age, maybe they're later in life like me.
Right.
uh, yeah, there is a grieving process because you're losing things. You're doing like in the Cain and Abel story, you're making sacrifices like Abel. If you choose to make those sacrifices, I mean, they're real. The the positive side, the silver lining is that knowing what I know now, I of course in retrospect, hindsight's 2020, I can't believe it was such a hard decision or that I did grieve so much because you don't know what's in the unknown when you lose
That's
things.
true. You've got
And
that blank space.
you have no
Right.
idea what's coming after, and so you still have to, you will have fear about that.
Mm.
um, I had a period of, I had written to Jordan Peterson after watching some of his videos, and he read one of my letters on his channel, and I was so terrified. I was still working in entertainment at the time. I was still known as the feminist, the woke manager, worked with woke comedians. I was so afraid of what if somebody figures out that that's me that wrote that letter. And he said at the time, you need to get over your fear. But that was 6 months later until I was over my fear. I knew logically what he was saying, what he meant, and I agreed, but it was a process. It took me 6 more months until I wrote my first essay of trying to come out and explain to my social justice friends what I was grappling with. And during those 6 months, it was just, I guess it was a period of both becoming more confident in what I, as an individual, actually believed. What things had I interrogated and come to my own opinion on?
Mhm.
And then also grappling with, well, what am I going to lose? And having to become okay with that. Because the fear of continuing to be a part of that ideology
Mhm.
became greater than the fear of what I was going to lose, because that ideology is evil.
Right.
It is racism disguised as anti-racism. It is sexism disguised as anti-sexism. It's oppression disguised as anti-oppression. Like to use people in the way that it does, and to turn people, well-intentioned, a lot of them kids, college
Mhm.
kids, and turn them into foot soldiers for such evil, for the
Right.
opposite thing of what they think they're doing. I couldn't stay quiet anymore.
Mhm.
And but when I did speak, it was like, yeah, these things happen. I lost my whole social circle, pretty much unfriended me eventually. Um, I had, have to get over that fear of what you're going to be called. This is big for kids because it's your whole social group that you might lose, and they're going to call you the worst thing that a person could be, a racist. And you know that it's not true, but what you have to get over that fear of what if everybody else thinks it's true. So what?
Right.
So what? The truth is more important. And
Right.
and when you come to that place, I don't know how you get there, but when you come to that place of saying the truth is more important, I'm going to cling to the truth even if everybody else believes the lie about me.
Right.
There's a whole grief that happens there. I think a lot of it is death of ego. I'm
Yeah.
still going through that in different ways. I guess you never get over learning death of ego, but it doesn't matter what they think. This guy asked me once, this was recently. People have these problems they do. They're like, would you rather, that game, would you rather?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it wasn't a would you rather, but it was similar. He said, well, I guess it was a would you. He said, would you rather have sex with a bear and have nobody know that you did that? Or would you rather not have sex with a bear and have everybody think you did? And I was like, I'd rather not have sex with a bear and have everybody think I did. Like,
Right.
duh. But that wasn't a duh for him. He was like shocked. He's like, well, I would rather have sex with a bear and have nobody ever know. I'm like, what? You would rather defile yourself and the bear, your sacred being? You would rather defile yourself and live with the lie that you had done that as long as nobody found out? That's awful. But I think that I bring that up because I think that's where a lot of social justice people are the ones who've started to question it anyway. They are like, I would rather live this lie of this evil ideology and let people think I believe in it too, than to have them all think I'm a racist, which I know is not true.
Right.
And they're so afraid of that. And you just have to let that die. That's your own ego. Who cares if everyone thinks the worst thing about you? That's not going to happen, by the way. You're going to find people who don't think that. I'm telling you. But even if that were to happen, I think people have to come to that place of accepting this may be the suicide of my professional life, my social circle, my what people think of me, my good name, right? Like all of that stuff.
Isn't that weird that your good name would be associated with so much hate and anger and fear and all these negative emotions? And every day I'm so glad I grew up with like Jiminy Cricket. It sounds so trite, but like always let your conscience be your guide. I remember even as a kid coming up against some of those situations. I mean, nothing like the bear, but the kind of thing where I knew in my mind that I hadn't done anything wrong, and that was so much better than doing something wrong and having to, like, even if no one knew about it, just like carrying around something that you are ashamed of, or carrying around something that you wish you didn't do. Those kinds of regrets are excruciating. And I can't imagine, I actually find it very liberating, very freeing to care less about what other people think. We all care a certain amount. There's nobody who cares zero. Okay. But the less I can care in many situations, like, it's very freeing. It's like a weight off your shoulders to be, I hate to use this word, but I'm gonna do it anyway, authentic. But to be your true self. And at the same time, I recognize that is something extremely difficult for children, because they're still figuring out who it is. But
they also know what authenticity is. Kids they can sniff it out.
That's true.
Even if they're in this cult of belief, that's what causes that internal, something's off and they don't quite know what it is, because they may meet a kid who's authentic and who's not part of the cult, and they may judge them because they're in the cult and this is what they're doing. But internally, they know. There's a part of them that knows the truth and that respects that person. I fully believe this because they can smell the authenticity. That's a person who actually is not a conformist, right? They know that. And meanwhile, they're all looking exactly the same and wearing their uniform and their blue hair and their mask and tats and piercings, and this person is like not conforming. They know that. And I think they secretly crave it, even if they've pushed it down. Kids especially want authenticity. So there's I know I'm bringing it back to the Bible, but I've found there, you were talking about how things that the seed, Cheeky Mare said seeds that are planted a long time ago and they maybe don't make sense until later. There's so many aphorisms, there's so many Bible verses, there's so many things that I used to think were cheesy and trite, and now I'm like, that's absolute truth. It makes sense. No wonder we say that, like. And
there's a reason that book is still around all this time.
Yes. So, and there's this one verse where Paul talks about all of his worldly accomplishments that he lost when he became a Christian. And he says, I consider them all dung. Poop. They're all shit.
Right.
All of those things that we put all this stock in, what other people think of us, our reputation, our accomplishments, none of that matters compared to having the truth.
I would agree. It's a tough lesson to learn though, and it takes a long time. I think for it's part of the maturation process is finding out like what actually matters, what lasts, and it's part of why I get so worked up when I see adults in a position to take care of children and teach children, telling them the opposite is true, like telling them your identity is this, and when you're 6, like that is so harmful. Like to tell a kid to nail a kid down to a
Yeah.
chart at such a young age and not just to, say, what, you're a work in progress. And I mean that word work in progress. In other words, you are going to be working on you. No one else can do it. No one can tell you who you are. No one can define you. And I thought the whole point of the movement to accept people who are gay and lesbian and so forth was to just be like, whoever you are, I love you anyway. Like you get to be who you want to be. You get to love who you want to love. You get to live life on your terms. But so do I. Like in other words, that was a mutual, like that people wanted mutual respect. And it's turned into, no, we're better beings than you.
Yeah.
And it's the superiority thing.
Yeah.
And, I mean, we could keep going and going and going for hours, but I know that you've got other things to do. And I'm so grateful that you came and shared all this so openly with us, because I know there are parents out there who are dealing with this. Like I said, probably most of them dealing with it like how I'm experiencing it, because that's just majority, but there are a fair number who probably have a child, might be a younger version of what you were when you went through it, but they're just sitting there like, what the hell? I sent my kid to college, a reasonably, normal person. I mean, I don't even say normal, but a person who I thought had their own identity, and now they're coming home parroting things like they're almost a robot. And I feel like you've given people hope. I hope people listening feel like that your child can come out on the other side of this.
It might be a long time.
Yeah.
My aunt prayed for me for 20 years.
Get busy, mom and dad.
That's amazing to me. And meanwhile, I was writing her letters telling her what a tool of white supremacist patriarchy she was.
I don't know, but I would love someday to create, maybe we can talk about it in another time, but create a course. It's almost like create a course. I mean, people would have to come to it of their own free will, obviously, but like a course for people ranging in age from, let's say, like 16 to whenever, infinity, that would be aimed at, re-examining your identity. So in other words, rather than putting it straight out there, like deprogramming your woke self or like, right.
Yeah.
But just kind of like, you could even put critical in there. You mentioned that there's not a lot of critical examination of this ideology. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, you could even create a course that was like critically examining your identity.
Critical theory.
Right. Or something. Yeah. But the point being, like, let's deconstruct this. Now, they may come away with it still feeling all attached to whatever, but I love your suggestion of asking questions. I love that approach. I think having people arrive at their own conclusions after being asked a series of probing questions is always more effective than lecturing. And, just say like, well, what do you mean by that? And can you give me an example? And like, how is this helpful in your life? And tell me how this is helping you thrive. And what do you anticipate the world will look like 20 years hence if you win? Like questions like this that, and even putting forth some alternative ideas about identity. There's some great writers through the ages. You can go with the ancients, you can go to the Bible, you can go to all different things that hone in on a different way to look at the self. And just put that in front of people and just be like, consider this in reference to your own identity right now. How do you feel about this statement? Mm-hmm. And just see what, it could be like a little webinar or symposium or something. But I think something like that, I think that it's worth creating, if only for the intellectual exercise of creating it and then having it live out there. Because I do think there's going to be a market for it.
Yeah.
And I don't say that cynically. I say I think there'll be people possibly like you who have something chip away at that armor that get breaks through, and then they're searching and they're like, okay, where do I, it's like this big void and I feel unmoored. But if you had a program that was like, we this try this might help you to go through this process and go through this grief and go through the things you need to go through to help you get there a little quicker, help you get through it. It's you can't not get through. You have to do it. And I hate to do that term. Like you have to do the work, but it was work for you.
Yeah.
It wasn't
And
easy.
yeah, and I guess one other bit of advice I would give parents if they are dealing with kids who've taken on this new belief system and are speaking it is just to be your beliefs in your behavior, because so much it doesn't matter what you say, truly it matters how you treat them.
Yeah.
And what your behavior is, and that people notice, that they can tell. They'll remember the way that you treated them. They may not remember what you said you believed about individualism and authoritarianism, but they'll remember the way that you treated them. And I've had people tell me that I helped wake them up. It's never been a conscious decision. Or, I mean, other than, doing my show, sure. But it's never been like me preaching to them.
Right.
It's always been something I can't really put my finger on, where their heart opens to me a little because of probably my behavior and the way that I'm trying to be my beliefs, like Jordan Peterson talks about.
Yeah.
This other way of being. And if they don't have that, especially someone in social justice is fueled by resentment and depression, and so many people in it are unhappy, and if they see you and the way that you live life is different, and you're not burdened with all of that depression, anxiety, resentment, and you are someone who they would think of as joyful or full of gratitude or whatever. If you're behaving in the way that you truly believe is best to live in the world, they'll see that.
Yeah.
They'll see that. People want that.
I believe that is true. And I think that's a really powerful message to end on, is just, live your beliefs and be, like be that example. And if nothing else, it strengthens your own resolve to continue to be the person, on the outside of that mainstream, whatever it is. And no matter how that changes, to just remain committed to your own definition of identity, your own definition of yourself and your values and your boundaries.
Yeah.
So I think that's very powerful. Yep. Live it, breathe it, exist, just, and
be a true nonconformist, kids.
Right. Right. I love this up here, Dion. Did you see what Dion put up here? It's like, nonconformists travel as a rule in bunches. You rarely find a nonconformist who goes it alone. And woe to him inside a nonconformist clique who does not conform with nonconformity. Eric
That's
Hoffer.
perfect. Yes, that's perfect.
It's so true. But like I said, we used to see them at school and high school and be like, there was the group of this and the group of that, but they didn't have this, I occupy the moral high ground nonsense. That's
different.
Relatively new. And it's not new in the world. It existed in the Chinese Cultural Revolution and others, but it's new here now. So, well, Keri, thank you so much. Everybody, please make sure you go subscribe to Deprogrammed so you can get more of Keri and more of her content and learn more about all of these things. And I am very grateful that you came and shared all this with us today.
Thank you for having me on. That was fun.
So
it didn't feel like 2 hours.
I know it went by. So thanks to everyone who came, and please like, share, comment, and subscribe. I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and I will see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.